By the spring of 1943, the North Atlantic had become a graveyard measured not in headstones, but in oil slicks and empty horizons. The water was cold, perpetually gray, and indifferent to the men who disappeared beneath it. For nearly 4 years, German U-boats had moved through these waters with a predator's confidence, slipping between convoys, surfacing under cover of darkness, and vanishing before dawn. But in May of that year, something changed. The ocean, which had once offered concealment, began to betray them. The darkness that had been their ally became transparent, and the hunters, for the first time since the war began, found themselves pursued by something they could not see, could not hear, and could not escape. The war in the Atlantic had always been a war of mathematics, tonnage sunk versus tonnage built, submarines deployed versus submarines destroyed, lives lost versus supplies delivered. For Germany, the equation had been favorable. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, had understood this arithmetic with cold precision. He did not need to win the Atlantic. He only needed to sink merchant ships faster than the Allies could replace them. If Britain's lifeline could be severed, the island would starve, and the war in Europe would collapse before American industrial power could be brought to bear. By 1942, the strategy seemed to be working. U-boats were sinking over 500,000 tons of Allied shipping each month. Convoys moved in fear. Merchant sailors spoke of the Atlantic crossing as a lottery no one wanted to win. But war is not only mathematics, it is also technology, and technology had begun to shift in ways the Kriegsmarine could not fully comprehend. The U-boat commanders who left port in early 1943 expected the same ocean they had known in 1940. They expected to hunt at night, to dive by day, to use the vastness of the Atlantic as both weapon and shield. What they encountered instead was an ocean that had learned to see in the dark. The first sign came not as a sighting, but as an absence. Convoys that should have been vulnerable began to slip past undetected. U-boats that surfaced to recharge batteries found themselves illuminated by searchlights before they could dive. Radio men reported aircraft appearing from nowhere, attacking in weather that should have grounded all patrols. Commanders who had survived 2, 3, 4 patrols began sending messages back to Lorient and Brest with a new tone, not panic, but confusion. The rules of engagement had changed, and no one had told them how. What they did not know, what they could not know, was that above them, invisible and relentless, a net was tightening. It was not made of steel or rope. It was made of radio waves. The technology was called centimetric radar, though that name would have meant nothing to the men peering through periscopes in the spring of 1943. It operated on a wavelength of 10 centimeters, a frequency so short that existing German detection equipment could not sense it. British and American engineers had miniaturized the apparatus, mounting it in long-range patrol aircraft that could remain airborne for 8, 10, 12 hours at a time. These planes, Liberators, Sunderlands, Catalinas, flew patterns over the mid-Atlantic Gap, the area beyond the range of land-based fighters where U-boats had once roamed freely. The radar allowed them to detect a submarine's conning tower from miles away, in darkness, in fog, in conditions where human eyes were useless. But radar alone was not enough. The Allies paired it with another weapon, one even more insidious: the high-frequency direction finder, known among radio men as Huff-Duff. Every time a U-boat transmitted a position report, a sighting, a request for orders, radio stations across the Atlantic triangulated the signal. Within minutes, patrol aircraft could be vectored to the source. The Germans had been trained to keep transmissions brief, but brevity was irrelevant. A single burst of Morse code, lasting seconds, was enough to mark a submarine's grave. The U-boat crews began to notice the pattern in April. Boats that broke radio silence were attacked within hours. Boats that maintained silence were sometimes left alone, drifting undetected for days. Commanders started to suspect their own communications were the problem, but the Kriegsmarine's operational doctrine required regular reporting. Dernits needed to coordinate wolf packs, to mass submarines against convoys, to direct the fleet like a conductor directing an orchestra. Silence meant invisibility, but it also meant isolation. The choice was paralysis or exposure, and neither was survivable. Then there was the Leigh Light. British Wellington bombers began carrying powerful searchlights that could be switched on in the final seconds of an attack run. A U-boat caught on the surface at night would see nothing until the last moment, a blinding column of light, the roar of engines, and then depth charges tumbling through the darkness. The psychological effect was profound. Darkness had been safety. Now darkness was a trap. By May 1943, the loss rate had become unsustainable. In the first 22 days of that month, the Kriegsmarine lost 31 U-boats. Some were sunk by escorts, others by aircraft. A few simply vanished, their last transmissions cut short mid-sentence, leaving behind only silence and the slow dispersal of oil across cold water. The men who survived these attacks and returned to port spoke in subdued voices about oceans that saw everything, skies that hunted without rest, and an enemy that seemed to know where they would be before they arrived. May 1943 was not a setback, it was the month the U-boat war broke. For the veterans of the early war years, the ones who had sailed when U-boats prowled with impunity, this new reality was incomprehensible. They had been taught that the Atlantic was too vast for total surveillance, that the ocean's size was their greatest protection. But size, they now understood, was irrelevant when the enemy could see through weather, through night, through the very darkness that had once made them invisible. The symbolic collapse was not immediate. It happened in stages, in the accumulation of small realizations. A commander would surface to recharge batteries, as he had done 100 times before, and this time an aircraft would appear within minutes. A radio man would send a routine position report, as doctrine required, and the boat would be depth-charged before dawn. A lookout would scan an empty horizon at midnight and see nothing, and then the searchlight would ignite above him, and he would understand that he had been seen long before he could see. One element recurred in the patrol logs and survivor testimonies from this period: the sound of engines. Not the U-boat's own diesel engines, familiar and almost comforting in their rhythm, but the distant droning persistence of aircraft engines circling overhead. In earlier years, the sound of an aircraft had been a warning to dive. By mid-1943, it was often the last sound men heard before the depth charges began to fall. The engine noise became a kind of auditory countdown, a reminder that the ocean's surface was no longer neutral ground, but a killing field under constant observation. The Kriegsmarine tried to adapt. New schnorkel devices were tested, allowing submarines to run diesel engines while submerged, reducing the need to surface. Improved radar detectors were distributed, though they could not detect centimeter radar and often gave false alarms that left crews exhausted and paranoid. Some commanders began sailing in shallow coastal waters where aircraft were less effective, but this brought them into range of surface escorts and minefields. Others tried sailing alone, abandoning the wolf pack tactics that had been so effective in 1942, but isolated submarines were easier to hunt and less able to overwhelm convoy defenses. Nothing worked. The Atlantic had become transparent. The statistical record is unambiguous. In the first 4 months of 1943, Germany lost 64 U-boats. In May alone, they lost 41.
By June, Dönitz was forced to withdraw his submarines from the North Atlantic entirely, conceding the battlefield for the first time in the war. The decision was presented as a temporary measure, a tactical repositioning while new technologies were developed, but the men who received those orders understood what they meant. The Atlantic, which had been the Kriegsmarine's hunting ground, had become a place where survival was no longer probable. What the U-boat crews experienced in those months was not merely military defeat, it was the collapse of a fundamental assumption. They had believed, as their training and their early successes had taught them, that technology and tactics could overcome industrial disparity, that a smaller, more efficient force could outmaneuver a larger, wealthier one. The British had been bled to the edge of collapse in 1942. Victory seemed possible, even likely, and then, in a span of weeks, the equation reversed. The men who returned from failed patrols in the summer of 1943 did not speak of cowardice or poor leadership. They spoke of being hunted by machines they could not detect, attacked by forces they could not see, and pursued across an ocean that offered no refuge. They described the experience in terms that were almost dreamlike, the sensation of being watched without knowing from where, the certainty of being tracked without understanding how, the growing awareness that every action, surfacing, transmitting, moving, brought the enemy closer. There is a photograph from this period taken at the U-boat base in Lorient. It shows a crew disembarking after a patrol. The men are young, most of them in their early 20s, but their faces carry an exhaustion that age alone cannot explain. They do not smile. They do not celebrate survival. They move with the slow, mechanical movements of men who have learned that luck is finite and that the ocean, which once protected them, has become hostile in ways they cannot control.
The transformation was not only tactical, it was ideological. The U-boat service had been portrayed in German propaganda as an elite force, the spearhead of a new kind of warfare, proof that German ingenuity and discipline could overcome Allied numerical superiority. The men who joined the service believed this, or wanted to believe it. But belief requires evidence, and by the summer of 1943, the evidence pointed elsewhere. The Allies were not merely larger, they were faster, more innovative, more capable of adapting to changing circumstances. They had built systems, radar networks, aircraft production lines, code-breaking operations that functioned with an efficiency the Kriegsmarine could not match. The realization spread slowly, carried in letters home, in conversations between crews, in the silences of men who had seen too much. It was not expressed in grand terms or political declarations. It appeared instead in small admissions that the war was harder than expected, that survival was a matter of chance more than skill, that the promises made in 1939 had not accounted for what the enemy could build when pushed. And what the enemy had built was staggering. By 1943, the United States was producing merchant ships faster than U-boats could sink them. Liberty ships, crude and utilitarian, rolled off assembly lines at a rate of 3 per day. Escort carriers, small aircraft carriers designed specifically for anti-submarine warfare, entered service in numbers that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. Long-range patrol aircraft, equipped with radar, depth charges, and acoustic homing torpedoes, covered areas of ocean that had previously been beyond reach. The industrial capacity of the Allied powers, which German strategists had acknowledged but underestimated, had become the decisive factor in the Atlantic War. The U-boat men understood this in practical terms. They saw it in the frequency of air attacks, in the sophistication of convoy defenses, in the relentless pressure that gave them no time to rest, repair, or regroup. What had once been a war of stealth and surprise had become a war of attrition, and attrition favored the side with deeper reserves. There is a persistent myth that the German submariners lost faith suddenly,
that morale collapsed in a single catastrophic moment. The reality was more gradual and more corrosive. It was the accumulation of failed patrols, the steady increase in loss rates, the growing certainty that each voyage might be the last. Men continued to serve, not because they believed in victory, but because duty, loyalty, and the absence of alternatives left them no choice. Some still hoped for a technological breakthrough, new submarines, better torpedoes, wonder weapons that would reverse the tide. But hope, unsupported by evidence, becomes a kind of hollow ritual, repeated without conviction. By the autumn of 1943, the Atlantic War had effectively ended as a strategic threat. Submarines continued to operate, continued to sink ships, continued to tie down Allied resources, but they no longer threatened Britain's survival. The convoys that had once crossed the Atlantic in fear now crossed with confidence. The oil, the food, the weapons, the troops, all of it reached Britain in quantities sufficient to sustain the war effort and prepare for the invasion of Europe. The men who survived the Atlantic War carried its lessons with them. They learned that invisibility is temporary, that technology evolves faster than tactics, and that industrial power, once mobilized, is almost impossible to overcome. They learned that the ocean, vast and indifferent, offers no inherent protection, and that darkness, which seems absolute, can be penetrated by those with the tools to see. In the end, the Atlantic after 1943 was not the same ocean that the U-boats had known in 1940. It had not changed physically. The water was still cold, the distances still immense, the weather still brutal, but it had changed in meaning. It was no longer a hunting ground. It was a proving ground for a different kind of warfare, one in which information, coordination, and industrial output mattered more than individual courage or tactical brilliance. The engine noise that U-boat crews heard in those final months, the steady, relentless droning of patrol aircraft circling above, became the sound of a war they could not win. It was not the sound of a single enemy or a single machine. It was the sound of a system, vast and impersonal, that had learned to see what they had once hidden, to reach what they had once escaped, and to sustain a level of pressure that no amount of skill or determination could withstand. And when the last U-boats withdrew from the North Atlantic in the summer of 1943, they left behind an ocean that had been transformed. It was no longer a place where submarines could hide. It was a place where freedom, defended by men and machines working in concert, had proven stronger than the darkness that had sought to drown it.